So, if this is the plight of a person who takes just one, not the entire law, just one, and not even one of the big ones, but just one of the small ones, whatever that might mean. Maybe taking, I think, a mother bird and its eggs. That you might think that's not right up there with adultery and other things, but you might think that that's a fairly minor law, or maybe mixing seed or things like that. Whatever you think the least commandment is, if you set that aside, if you say, I don't need to keep that one, I'll keep the rest. I'll keep the 612 other commandments, but that one minor one, that one little itsy bitsy one, that one that I just can't get my head around why it's there. And so I'm not going to keep it. I'm going to set it aside, and I'm going to tell other people that I'm going to set it aside and suggest they do the same. You're just inside the door of the kingdom of heaven, according to this statement. According to this statement, Jesus is warning people about what they do with the law and the prophets, right? This is what it's about in context. This is about him saying, don't think that I've come to abolish the law and the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. So he's here saying, I haven't come to get rid of them. In fact, if anybody takes the least commandment and says you don't need to keep this anymore, they're just right next to the gate of the kingdom, and they are considered the least. In other words, everybody in the kingdom is going to be looking down their nose at this person who has decided to violate or to set aside one minor commandment. Okay, not a major one, and not two, just one small. So, if you think that there's one small commandment that you don't need to follow, then, well, this is the warning that Jesus gives. Now, I need to put this in context again. I think this can be well established through the teaching of Tanakh and through the Jewish tradition that it was never expected for non-Jews to keep the Torah. So this is not a warning really to non-Jews. This was a warning to Jews. The importance of the observance of Torah in the eyes of Jesus. JC, when he's here saying these things, he is saying them to a Jewish audience, and it seems to me that that's who he was actually referring to. He wasn't referring to non-Jews because he didn't have a non-Jewish audience. You may say, well, he knew in the future. Cars. Yeah, well, I suppose maybe it's true that he did know, in which case then you're in trouble, because if he knew that a non-Jewish audience was going to be listening to this, then to them he is saying the smallest of the Torah, the smallest commandment of the Torah, you can't set aside, and you should never teach other people to do the same. Now, just in case we don't get I don't know if the word is juxtaposition, the distance between what is unacceptable behavior, I don't know when I'm going to run out of room in the camera, and what is unacceptable behavior versus what is acceptable behavior. And this we find in the next statement. He says, but whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. So if you practice and teach the Torah, you'll be called great in the kingdom of heaven. That's the one side, and on the other side is the ones who basically say, well, there's one minor law, there's one insignificant law that I'm not going to practice. That is the least to the greatest in the kingdom. The least keeps all of the Torah except for the one minor point in which he disagrees with. But the rest he keeps. And the greatest is the one who teaches everything, including that minor law. Now, I don't think that I'm taking things out of context when I say that. That's what the statement says. And so we finish this off with, "For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven." So it sounds like, and you're going to say, "Oh, but Prescott, what about faith? What about grace? That's why we have grace, because nobody can do the works of the law." You may be mixing two different things into this little picture, because again, what we are referring to is we are referring to the difference between instructions that are given to non-Jews versus instructions that are given to Jews. And this is very clearly directed at a Jewish audience who were expected to observe the Torah. And one of the problems that I've mentioned before is that later on, you can make the arguments that you want about what Jews or what non-Jews are required to do, or what they are allowed to get away with, or they don't need the rules that they don't need to keep and the rules that they do need to keep. But the problem is that, well, as I don't know if I've said this in a previous video or not, but one of the problems is that what if a Jew came into your church and after listening to the message, and let's say he was a non-observant Jew. Let's say he did not really, he never really paid attention to Judaism. Maybe his grandparents did, maybe his great-grandparents did. But he was, for all intents and purposes, a secular Jew, comes into your church, hears the pastor preach a rousing sermon, an altar call is given, and he goes forward and becomes a Christian. Or he repents of his sin and is returning back to God. What does that church tell him he should do? He says to the person who comes to pray with him, he says, "I'm a Jew." He says, "What do I do? What should I do?" Do you think that the person in the congregation who's leading this person in the sinner's prayer, do you think that he's saying to him, "You know what you need to do is you need to plug into the local synagogue. You need to go and meet the rabbi. You need to go and learn how to observe the Torah, because that's what Jesus would want you to do"? Do you think that that's what would happen? And the answer, I say to you unequivocally, is absolutely not. You know it, and I know it. This would never happen in a million years. And so that, to me, points out the problem or the separation that has occurred at some point in time as we go through the story of the development of this sect of Christianity, or if you want to call them the Nazarenes, or whatever you want to refer to them as, that at some point in time, it wasn't just that non-Jews didn't need to keep the law or observe the law, as was always the case except for groups within Judaism that do exist, and we know that they do exist because I've encountered them, and they do exist, Jews who believe that non-Jews should be converting and getting circumcised, and this is the proper course of action for a non-Jew who wishes and desires to worship the God of Israel. But by and large, Judaism says no, non-Jews are not required to do this. They are just required to observe the 7 laws of Noah, or the Noahide laws, the Sheva Mitzvot, whatever you want to call them. And so Judaism has always taken the position that non-Jews don't need to observe all of the Torah. But Jews do. They don't have a choice. They were born and circumcised, and the choice was made for them, like it or not. I'm not saying that it's a fair rule. I'm not saying that I'm not even making any kind of judgment about it, because this is their ball game. I won't make a joke about that. This is their rules for their faith, for their religion, and as such, if you are a Jew, born a Jew, according to what we read both in the Torah and the prophets, and now reading what Jesus says, if you are a Jew, it is required that you observe the Torah. He expects you to observe all of the Torah if you are going to follow him. Now, I'll leave the debate between the Messianic Jews and the Orthodox community to decide how that all works for themselves as bona fide Jews. And I'm a non-Jew, so I'm not weighing in on that particular discussion. My concern here is how we have taken something that Jesus has said, and we have completely ignored everything that it obviously says. From reading it here, it's obvious what it is actually saying. I could actually go into the rest of the Sermon on the Mount, where he actually talks about specific laws and some of the extrapolations that he draws from those laws in terms of how he thinks that, for instance, murder is akin to saying something nasty about your brother, or that adultery is akin to looking at a woman and having any kind of desire in your heart, and that that the laws themselves, he doesn't even take them only in a literal way, but he extends what the literal law says into further meanings of the law, which actually sounds pretty orthodox. It sounds pretty pharisaical. It sounds like what even modern Judaism does when they actually look at the Torah and try to draw out of the Torah the meaning in other ways and in other areas of our lives that we can learn from these different rules in the Torah and how they apply to other areas of our life. Even Paul did this with I'm going off track here, but even Paul did this when he was referring to the conversation about whether apostles should be paid for preaching the gospel or not. Now, I don't think that Paul was advocating paying them money, because he says they should be paid according to the Lord's command, and the Lord's command, if you read the Gospels, was that they were to receive. They were permitted to stay at someone's house and to be fed. Nothing about a paycheck, and nothing about fancy houses, and nothing about television spots and all the rest of it. So according to the Lord's own command, it was about simply the basic, food and a roof over your head wherever you go and do your thing. And Paul, he says, well, doesn't the law say that you aren't to muzzle the ox while it's treading out the grain? And he says, you don't actually think that God was concerned about oxen, do you? He says, no, this was written for us. Okay. And I read in Aidan Steinsaltz's books, The Essential Talmud, where I think it was a 2nd century rabbi made the statement that anyone who thinks that the ox that is referred to in the Torah is actually about an ox doesn't understand the Torah. And so it was never intended to simply be understood in its literal form. And anyway, but that's might be something else that I might deal with later on. But anyway, the point is that here in this statement, Jesus very clearly makes the point that for a Jew, you are required to observe the Torah. And anybody who comes along and says that you don't have to do that, or that you can set aside any of the Torah, they are the least in the kingdom of heaven. There's nobody lower than that. Next step is out the door.